right. Welcome to lesson 3 of American Imperialism for American History. Lesson 3 today will be talking about the Spanish-American War, the one real conflict the U.S. Engaged in wholly during our age of imperialism. So first thing to realize is what causes the Spanish-American War? Why does the U.S. get involved? The number one reason is that Spain was ruling over the Cubans with despotic means, or they were oppressing them, denying them liberties, they were taxing them. A lot of the very same reasons that we declared our independence from Great Britain. So there's a degree of empathy there. From the United States to Cuba, because we have gone through similar circumstances. When the Spanish will revolt due to Jose Marti inciting the rebellion and burning many of the cane fields, the Spanish will respond by sending in Valeriano Weyler. He's also known as the Butcher. Very harsh individual, very brutal tactics. He sends anybody that's suspected of inciting rebellion against the Spanish crown into concentration camps where they're barely fed, they're not given medical attention. It's almost like a death sentence. Very similar in treatment to the Nazi concentration camps of World War II that everybody's fairly familiar with. And it's that treatment that brings a lot of harsh feelings from Americans to the Spanish that are in control of Cuba. The second main reason why we get involved is economics. Economics 101, we trade with Cuba. Cuba grows some cotton, Cuba grows some indigo, but mainly they grow sugar and tobacco. And America consumes large amounts of both of those. The trade between the two, the island of Cuba and the United States, amounts to about $100 million per year in 1900 money. So that's a lot of money that's going to be lost out if we aren't able to continue to trade with them. The second is that American plantation owners and wealthy business owners have invested a lot of money into Cuba to the tune of about $50 million in just sugar and tobacco plantations so that they can grow more product more efficiently. And then the third factor is the yellow journalists, guys like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, who are trying to sell more magazines. And that's their number one priority, is to sell more magazines and newspapers. They are going to come up with headlines that will bring people in. They want to read the story. Many of the stories will be completely fabricated. They'll be false, made up. Great works of fiction. They're great writing, but they're portrayed as truth, and that's what's wrong with yellow journalism. Very similar today to on social media, clickbait, where you have this really good, really intriguing title, and you click on it, and it's a bunch of ads, or it's nothing like what you had seen on the title. So yellow journalism is going to sensationalize, and for those that are not aware of its falsehoods, it's going to emotionalize them, and it's going to start to bring them in an anti-Spanish mentality. So the next really big event that turns Americans away from Spanish rule is the Delome letter. So there's a Spanish ambassador sent from Spain to the United States. His name is Senor Don Enrique Dupe Delome. His job as an ambassador is to talk with American delegates, talk about the vast array of foreign policy, how it concerns Spain. I mean, he's worried with Spain, and then he's going to report back to the Spanish crown. And he's going to write letters because instant communication doesn't exist. So he writes a letter and he sends it off. Well, Cuba happens to be the hub for communication going back to Spain for this hemisphere. And in the midst of the revolution going on, or the attempted revolution going on in Cuba, they raid one of the mail houses. They find this letter. They find a little tidbit of information that they think Americans can use, and they send it back to America, where William Randolph Hearst, the yellow journalist, is going to grab a hold of it because this is gold. And the part that he is going to exploit is a tidbit where Delome has stated that McKinley, our president, is not a great leader. He has weaknesses. He's just kind of criticizing his leadership skills. Very, very common for that position to do things like that, telling, hey, we can take advantage of this characteristic or this part of his leadership. Well, when DeLome prints it, he prints it as though it was the most outrageous or the worst insult in American history to a president. And this really whips the American public, the average Americans, into a fervor of anti-Spanish, everything but war to this point. Now we're just really angry at Spain. And no matter what they do, we're going to continue to be angry. And that brings us to the sinking of the Maine. So diplomatic relations are starting to deteriorate between Spain and the United States. And it's common practice, even to this day, that if diplomatic relations deteriorate and the American public or people that are present in areas and under the control of where the diplomatic ties are being strained, the Americans will send in a battleship or a fleet to help evacuate and protect the Americans that are present there and give them a chance to get out before anything further happens or war breaks out where they might become prisoners. So we send the USS Maine down to Cuba and we say, okay, we'll have a battleship there. As it pulls in, it mysteriously explodes. As it's dropping anchor, nobody really understands why, but there's this massive explosion and the USS Maine sinks to the bottom of Havana Harbor. Now, the American public, who's already anti-Spanish, says this has got to be the Spanish. They mined it, or they had a saboteur on board, or kind of a buzzword of the day is there's a torpedo. They were waiting with a torpedo, although torpedoes did not exist at this point in time. As we look back on this, and there were separate investigations done by the Spanish and by the American governments, they find that this steamboat, this battleship that's powered by steam, in its boiler room was powered by coal. And so as you scoop the coal out of the coal bin and bring it over to the furnace and you throw it in, you are actually grinding some of the remaining coal down. You're walking over coal chunks, which is grinding it further down, causing this coal to grind into a very fine dust in some instances. And coal dust is very, very flammable, very similar to how gunpowder is flammable. And if you have ever lit off a firework, then you know that compressed gunpowder in a cylindrical cardboard tube is going to make a pop because there's nowhere for the burning substance to go. This combustion has nowhere to go except outward, and so it's going to burst the seams of the cardboard, creating a pop or a bang. And that's very similar to what happens in the USS Maine, is that this coal dust rumor that we're speculating now, this catches fire and it's burning very quickly and there's nowhere for this combustion to go, causing a massive explosion and 260 Americans on board. They're all killed. And so the fingers get pointed at Spain. It's Spanish fault because the American public is already anti-Spanish. American public is now calling for war, and William McKinley, who's not for war, he was an enlisted man in the American Civil War and did not necessarily care for the conduct of war. He knew how bloody and terrible it was. He didn't want to go to war, but he issues a declaration to Congress saying, I think we have to go to war here. One, because the people are demanding it. Two, it seems that Spain and America are destined for a war. Everything we do is we're bumping into each other and we're making each other more angry. And three, our democracy has to be protected. Democracy in this hemisphere has to be protected. We can't have monarchies and dictatorships ruling all over. We have to protect our democracy. So on April 20th, 1898, he will issue this, and Congress will pass a very quick resolution to declare war on Spain. But they will attach an amendment, an addendum to it called the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment states that we will go to war with Spain, but at the conclusion of this war, Cuba will not be annexed by the United States. Cuba will be left to the control of its people, meaning that they'll set up a government once this is all done. We will talk about the Platt Amendment, which will come into play after the war. And with that, we are formally at war. George Dewey gets a telegraph. He is in Beijing, China. He gets a telegraph from the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, one Theodore Roosevelt, saying that we need to attack the Philippines. It'll be a surprise attack. The Spanish will never see it coming. And so Dewey quickly takes the new Steel Navy of the United States, the Pacific Fleet, and goes from Beijing in a hop, skip, and a jump just south and east of China down to the Philippines. And we'll find the Spanish fleet anchored in Manila Bay, Manila being the capital of the Philippines. It's like shooting fish in a barrel as the Americans open fire. The degraded and upkept Spanish fleet is no match for the new Steel Navy, as the Spanish Navy largely is still caravels, wooden ships, similar to the Pirates of the Caribbean style ships. And with that, it's a very swift victory, but Dewey cannot send troops on because he doesn't have enough troops to take out the Spanish fortifications on the island. And so there's kind of the standoff where our Navy's there, but their army's there with enough people to repel us. That is until we get Emilio Aguinaldo and the Filipino rebellion and insurgents to help us, which will help us take the Philippines. We'll talk about that here in just a little bit. Back across to Cuba, we do send in our army. We send in some of our Navy. It's 90 miles off the coast of Cuba, so it's not like we had to transport them very far. But there is a all-volunteer regiment of soldiers called the Rough Riders. And it's often described as like back alley brawlers and drunkards, the people that weren't in the military but wanted to go fight. They're led by Colonel Woods, and so that's the military commander. He's the one that kind of coordinates with the U.S. military, but they were organized and brought down and partially led by Theodore Roosevelt, who had resigned his commission as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy to lead this volunteer regiment in. And their moment of glory is when they see San Juan Hill, this hill that overlooks Santiago Harbor, has a fortification on top. The U.S. Army was just willing to starve them out and wait them out, but the Rough Riders demand that they get a chance to go take it, and they charge up this hill, getting shot at, retreating, re-rallying, and they're actually able to take this hill, San Juan Hill, giving them this Medal of Honor that they got to take this hill. The U.S. Army was not willing to. Another major battle in Cuba was where the Spanish fleet came in. There was a tropical storm. I don't know how powerful, but the Spanish fleet took refuge in Santiago Harbor, and the remainder of the American fleet, which is not necessarily Steel Navy, but some of our older ships, finds them anchored in Santiago Harbor, very similar to how Manila Bay was. We signal to them to surrender. Their admiral refuses, and we decimate, completely destroy the Spanish fleet. That was the remnants, the remainder of the Spanish fleet that was present. After we have taken Cuba, which didn't take much, we venture over to Puerto Rico, which is down the chain of islands there in the Caribbean. There's not a whole lot of military present, and when we step foot onto the island, the Puerto Ricans are overjoyed to see us. We're greeted like heroes, and America then will plant its flag and officially claim Puerto Rico as a spoil of war. The Four-Acre Act of 1900 will give Puerto Rico a territorial status. They are now a part of the U.S., but they are not given citizenship. So the insular cases by the Supreme Court say that just because we take them over and absorb them into our country does not necessarily mean that they gain instant citizenship. They still need to go through the naturalization process. Although if they have a child, now that that's a U.S. territory, that child will be given citizenship under U.S. law. So something to interestingly note on a side note from Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, very, very minor fighting going on during this war. We actually lose more soldiers. The U.S. loses more soldiers to yellow fever, to malaria, and to other sicknesses than we do to the fighting. After we take the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Spain's done. It's not worth it to them to continue this fight. They're losing more territory to the Americans. And so they call for an armistice. They ask for a ceasefire so that we can talk peace. We will go to Paris, and a delegate from France will moderate between us and Spain. We demand that Cuba gains its independence, and we want the territories of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines from Spain as spoils of war since we won. They're asking for peace. We won. Spain refuses, saying that that's too much territory. They will agree to Puerto Rico and Guam, but they want us to pay for the Philippines. And this also comes from the fact that at the time that we actually plant our flag and take the Philippines happens to be the day after the armistice was asked for. So Spain signals for an armistice, but we're not able to relay that message quick enough to George Dewey and the soldiers in the Philippines. And so they take it unknowing that the armistice has been signed, and a few days later they find out. And then there's an argument over whether or not we should technically be able to take that away from Spain or not. But it's far enough across the globe that Spain says it's too costly for us to continue to maintain. We'll sell it to you, and we buy it for $20 million. So the Spanish-American War is officially over. And one of the first actions that we come back with is to say, okay, Cuba, you will gain your independence. However, in order for us to remove our troops who are all over your country right now, you have to do a few things. So this Platt Amendment to the end of the war for you is going to say, one, you have to create a government of Cubans, and the Cubans have to govern Cuba. There cannot be a foreign nation. Spain cannot come back in here. Britain cannot come back in here. No other nation can come in and govern you. You must govern yourselves. Two, we want a perpetual lease of Guantanamo Bay. That naval base, their largest naval base, belongs to us. We want that because we helped you get your independence. And today, we still do control that, although we lease it for like $99 a year. And then Cuba becomes a protectorate. They govern themselves. They have that freedom. But if they ever need economic, military, diplomatic help, they come to the United States, and we protect them military. And that's where the term protectorate comes from. The Philippines, as we buy them, that opens a whole Pandora's box of what should we do to them. There's the pro-annexation camp, or a group of people in the U.S., and there's the anti-annexation camp. The pro-annexation says it's our duty, very, very imperialistic, that we're better than them, we're more evolved, we're a more advanced nation, so we need to educate them, we need to uplift them because they're poor, backwards. You can see how it's almost condemning of the Filipino people, that they're not up to our standard of living. And then the annexation camp says that as their primary argument, annexing them and making them become a part of the United States would simply betray the Declaration of Independence. Very interesting sentiment here. As you hopefully have read the Declaration of Independence, there's the second and third paragraphs talk about why we declare our independence from Great Britain, kind of the philosophy of self-government that we believe in today. And there's a part that says that governments are instituted among men, deriving their power from the consent of the governed. And whenever a government becomes oppressive to these ends, it is the right of the people to rise up and to alter or abolish it. And by annexing them, we're not giving them that chance of self-government. We're not asking for their consent. We're just taking them over. What this does is it creates a massive fight. We do end up annexing the Philippines. And because we annex them, and many of the Filipino rebellion individuals, including Emilio Aguinaldo, look at this as a grievous insult, that they were fighting for independence alongside American soldiers from Spain. And instead of gaining independence, they simply went from being a Spanish territory to an American territory. And so this starts a guerrilla war called the Bola War by some, called the Filipino Rebellion, sometimes called the Philippine-American War. It lasts 3 years. We don't commit our full military strength to it. After 3 years, we are able to capture Emilio Aguinaldo. And once we capture him, the rebellion falls apart and the Bola War ends. And that brings us to the end of lesson 3. Lesson 4, stay tuned for, and we will talk more about how America then performs on the